Okay, welcome back. So let's get into our first example. You're the CFO of a firm that will be liquidated at its market value next year. For example, if the firm's worth 40 million, it's going to be liquidated, sold off for 40 million. The firm has a $15 million bond that is due next year. Your main concern is that if the firm cannot pay its debt in full, that a severe default will make it difficult for you to find future work as a CFO. You're debating whether to take on a risky project before the firm is liquidated next year. If the project goes forward, then the liquidation value of the firm could be much higher next year or much lower next year. So again, as we work through these examples, I want you to read the slide, pause it, set it up before you consult the solution that's posted on Blackboard. Make sure that you understand how to set up the problem and how to solve it, and then compare what you've done with what's posted. So the first question is, what's going to be the market value of assets that would allow the firm to pay off its debt next year? i.e., what level, what value does the firm have to have in order for us to not worry about defaulting on our bond? Suppose you decide to do nothing. In this case, the market value of the firm will equal either 20 million in the good state or 10 million in the bad state with equal probability. Therefore, when the firm is liquidated next year, the bondholder will receive the 15 million they're owed in the good state or only 10 million in the bad state. In each state, the stockholder is going to receive whatever remains after the bond is paid off. So for part B, what's going to be the expected liquidation value of the firm? And what is the expected payoff to bondholders and to stockholders? So the way to set this up, you're going to have the good state and the bad state, and then you're going to have the value of the firm and the payoff to bondholders and the payoff to stockholders. So you're going to set this up as a matrix and then just fill it in with what the values are and what happens next. Okay, let's look at two more parts for this question. Part C, suppose that you accept the risky project. In this case, the market value of the firm will equal either 30 million in the good state or 0 million in the bad state with equal probability. Therefore, when the firm is liquidated next year, the bondholder will receive the 15 million that they're owed in the good state or 0 in the bad state. What is the expected liquidation value of the firm? What's the expected payoff to the bondholders and the stockholders? Same intuition as before. You're going to set this up as a matrix. You've got the good state, the bad state, and the expected value. And then you also have the value of the firm, the market value of the firm, the payoff to bondholders, the expected payoff to stockholders, etc. Part D, if you wanted to maximize the expected payoff to stockholders, would you do nothing as in part B, or would you take on the risky project as in part C? So what are you doing? You're going to be comparing the expected payoff that I would get as a stockholder if I don't do anything, or a stockholder if we take the risky project. And if you're working on behalf of your own interests, what would you do and why? So as you set this up and as you work through it, you'll clearly find that there's a career concern that's going to be affecting the financial manager. Specifically, the financial manager is going to be more risk averse than we would expect if the manager were serving the best interest of the shareholders. And this is due to the fact that the manager won't be able to find a job should the company have a severe default. We can also see that there's a conflict of interest amongst the investors. So stockholders who own the firm have a residual claim on the cash flows, meaning they're only paid off once the debt's paid off. So they prefer that the manager take the risky project. In this example, the debt holders and the manager would prefer that the firm pursue safer cash flows that are more likely to pay back the debt. So what you're learning as you work through this example is that we have a conflict of interest, and we also have a setting in which the financial manager is behaving more risk averse than the shareholders would prefer. Example 2, you're the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that's publicly listed. Because you're the CEO, you have information that the public does not. The company has no debt and therefore faces no risk of default. Your main concern is that if the share price falls below $100 per share, that your stock options will be worthless. Your company owns the patent for one drug. If the drug receives FDA approval starting next year, the drug will generate cash flows of 160 million per year for the next 10 years. Without FDA approval, starting next year, the cash flows will be 40 million per year for the next 10 years. The cash flows have a discount rate of 6%. Okay, as you set this up, the first thing I want you to notice is that this is very similar to the problems that we've done before with annuities. So I've got different states of the world. I've got a state of the world where it can be 160 per year or 40 million per year. And I know that the cash flows start next year. So it's always going to let me know that I'm going to do a present value. But I know how long the cash flows are going to last. So as I put this into my annuity formula, I know that my number of years is going to be 10. Okay, questionnaire. If the public believes that there's a 20% chance that the FDA will approve the drug, what is the market value of the firm? Again, I've got a 20% chance that the cash flows are going to be 160, and I've got an 80% chance that the cash flows are going to be 40. I plug that in, and I can also take that number and then plug that average value into my annuity formula to find the market value of the firm. If there are 4 million shares outstanding, what is the current share price of the firm? This is an all equity firm, so there's no debt. So whatever the value of the market value of the firm's assets are, is going to be the value of the firm's equity. So to get the share price, I take that and I divide it by my 4 million shares outstanding. Okay. Part C. Suppose you know that the correct probability of FDA approval is actually 10%. What would be the value of the firm? Part D. Given that there are 4 million shares outstanding, what would be the share price of the firm if this information were made available to the public? So as we go from parts A and B to C and D, it turns out that the true probability of approval goes from being 20% to 10%. So for part E, we want to know how inflated is the current stock price, meaning that if this true probability of FDA approval were to be revealed to the public, the share price would change by how many dollars per share? In an example 2, the manager would prefer to not reveal the true information to the public. That is, the mispricing is to the manager's benefit. Suppose that instead of revealing the same information, you step down. Would you expect the stock price to go up or to go down given your departure? You'd probably expect the stock price to go down because that would be a negative signal to the market. So what's the takeaway? We can see in example 2 that the manager has a conflict of interest with the shareholders. That is, due to the concern with the stock options, the manager is not revealing information to the public that would reduce the stock price. And this type of behavior, waiting to reveal bad news to the market, is so well documented. There's a paper that's mentioned here from 2017 that shows that when CEOs receive large enough severance payments, so in their paper, they find that it's 8 million US, they no longer delay the disclosure of bad news. The findings basically support a lot of evidence, both theoretical and empirical, that managers delay revealing bad news due to their career concerns, and then also due to their concerns for things like stock price, stock levels for option markets. So the results really suggest that contracts can be made to realign incentives. The severance packages are sometimes really negatively reported on in the news. You'll hear the term golden parachutes, or you'll hear how a CEO is getting paid millions upon millions, even though they got fired. And part of the reason why you would have that type of a contract is because you really want to encourage the CEO to be less concerned about their career and less concerned about their next career and more concerned about your interest as a shareholder. So what else can be done to address these agency concerns and conflicts of interest? Let's look through. There are many different governance mechanisms that firms can use to actually kind of affect this corporate, this opportunity for agency concerns and conflicts of interest. So the first are incentive contracts. And this is what we just talked about with the severance payments. So incentive contracts like stock options, stocks, severance packages can help to align managers with investors. Remember, managers have discretion over the cash flow, but they don't have cash flow rights, nor do they have voting rights. So if managers become shareholders, then everybody wants the same thing. And hopefully that feels intuitive. If I give you stock and I give you stock options, and I'm basically making you a shareholder and I'm aligning your interest as a manager with our interest as shareholders. However, as we see with example two, there are also limits to this mechanism. Without proper safeguards in place, there can be strong incentives to manipulate information or to alter investment policies to keep share prices inflated. And we'll see this with all of these mechanisms. There's no one perfect mechanism that solves everything. Everything has its limitations. The next thing that's mentioned are activist shareholders. So the shareholder identifies companies that are being poorly managed. The key idea is that poor management is going to lower the share price. And hopefully that feels intuitive. If the company isn't using its capital and labor and taking advantage of its investment opportunities well, because management's a mess, then once we get rid of that management or once we change our strategy, we should see the stock price jump up. So the activists, you're going to buy enough shares to coordinate with either larger shareholders or to gain control of a board seat. And in this way, you're overcoming the free rider problem. The reason why you're overcoming the free rider problem is because your goal is to actually internalize this monitoring cost. So you pay this monitoring cost, but you do it so that you can basically affect the firm. So either way, the old managers are going to face the threat of unemployment. Because if you demand that the management turns the firm around or you push for new managers, you're basically saying whatever you've been doing hasn't been working. The activists may demand that a conglomerate be broken up or that the company change its strategy. So maybe you drop lines of business that you're unsuccessful in doing, things like that. And if successful, the stock price is going to increase. And now as the activist, you sell at the much higher price. Here's an example of an activist shareholder. So a few days before the 2019 Met Gala, the San Francisco-based activist fund, Vos Capital Management, alleged that Argo Group CEO Mark Watson III was using company money to fund his jet-setting lifestyle. Over the time of Mr. Watson being CEO of Argo, the firm had built up market valuations as high as 2.7 billion. So the company's worth a ton. And what these activists found is that they were basically deeply worried that the CEO's hobbies, pet projects, and cult of personality were being funded by the company. So what happened? Voch launched a letter to investors basically saying, hey, this is our worry, this is our concern. And the SEC did an investigation. The SEC found that Argo had understated Mr. Watson's perquisites by more than 5 million over a 5-year period. Among other failures of control, the SEC also noted that the company allowed Mr. Watson to approve his own expenses. For example, in 2019, Argo spent $60K for Mr. Watson to get tickets to the Met Gala. In 2018, they spent $70,000 for him to get tickets to the Met Gala. And as you can see from the slide, there are many other expenses that were basically used to kind of fund the lifestyle of the executive. These in and of themselves are not illegal. The question of legality is whether or not this is correctly reported to shareholders. So that's the issue, that if you're engaging in this behavior, but they're not being directly explained as clear expenses to shareholders, then you're basically stealing cash flows because you're not correctly explaining what's happening to the market. Another mechanism that's discussed is accounting transparency. So here's the issue. With short-term control rights, managers might act in their own short-term interests versus shareholders' long-term best interests. As we just discussed, one of the ways that that can happen is with the consumption of lavish benefits like jets and residences all around the world. Another way that this can happen is what's called tunneling. So this is where you steal resources or you directly defraud shareholders. For example, there are many reports of Russian oil companies that are known to sell to manager-owned trading companies at below market prices. So the oil might be trading at 80 bucks per barrel. I sell it to a manager-owned trading company at $70 per barrel. Automatically, by doing that, I've defrauded the company and I've basically pocketed $10 as a manager of this company, this relatedly owned company. To be clear, this happens in the US too. So shareholders bring lawsuits against managers. The best example is going to be Enron. Enron had over 3,000 subsidiaries and affiliates that were basically run or partly owned by Enron executives. What happened? Enron was one of the most successful energy and natural gas companies. However, managers of the firm increasingly got into the habit of creating offshore special purpose entities. They would take unprofitable entities, put them offshore, and then keep the profitable entities on the books. They would also engage in these dealings with related and owned companies. All of this was done as a way to basically keep the accounting numbers looking good. And these fraudulent activities eventually caught up with Enron and they filed for Chapter 11 for bankruptcy in late 2001. In response to all of this, we had Sarbanes-Oxley that was passed in 2002 as a way to curb this fraudulent accounting behavior. More generally, we can kind of talk about agency and these policy reforms. So the US Congress passed SOX in July 2002. And the key idea was to protect investors and to restore public confidence in corporate disclosing and in financial reporting. The major components of SOX were accounting regulations, you establish an audit committee, you have internal control assessments, and you also have executive responsibility, meaning that the CFO now has to sign off on actual company financials. Many smaller companies find the compliance with SOX, the increased SEC filings to be costly, and some foreign listed firms have chosen not to list in the US because of this high cost of compliance. We also have had the Dodd-Frank Act passed recently and with the Consumer and Protection Act in July of 2010. So this was in response to the Great Recession and the financial crisis of 2008. What are the major components? We have the Volcker Rule, which says that deposit-taking banks are banned from prop trading, meaning that they can't engage in speculative trades, and they can only own a small fraction of hedge fund and private equity firms. We also have the Resolution Authority, so the government can come and dismantle a bank that's too big to fail. And then we also have consumer protection. So we have a new independent Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that's designed to monitor predatory loans and other loan products. So we have the CFPB. In 2018, a lot of these rules were dialed back by the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act that basically weakened the Dodd-Frank Act. So it raised the threshold from 50 billion to 250 billion to determine banks that were basically too big to fail. And it said that banks with assets of 10 billion or less are going to be exempt from the Volcker Rule. So it kind of weakens a lot of these restrictions. The main takeaway is that yes, we can have accounting transparency, and we can even have laws that are put in place to make accounting transparency more important, but it's still limited. Okay, so we've gone through incentive contracts, shareholder activism, and accounting transparency. Next, we're going to examine debt, concentrated ownership, and then we'll talk a bit about overseas listings, and we'll look at the other mechanisms to address agency problems.